The first thing I want to do is just catch you up on what happened since we last met. We often don't think back to the previous session, and I think it's important to recap. So here's a brief recap. The 2018 session was mercifully short. It was a 60-day affair. They got out on time. Democrats flexed their newfound one-party control, and they passed a slew of bills. A lot of them were sort of pent-up Democratic priorities. They included a state voting rights act, a ban on Atlantic salmon net pens, an abortion coverage mandate for insurance companies. Lawmakers also put another $1 billion into public schools to comply with the Supreme Court ruling in the McCleary case, and they implemented a one-time property tax relief that kicks in this year. Then in June, after the legislature had gone home, the Supreme Court said the state is finally in compliance after a decade with the McCleary mandate. They closed out that lawsuit. Over the summer, teachers' unions in most of the districts across the state aggressively bargained new contracts. That resulted in some cases, significant double-digit pay increases. In other districts, we saw teacher strikes. We heard complaints coming out of that about the shortcomings in the regionalization formulas that the legislature had come up with to try to address cost of living disparities from district to district and region to region. And we heard concerns that districts had overpromised on salaries and would soon be in a situation where they were either using dollars that perhaps were supposed to be used for class size reduction to continue to pay the freight on the salaries, or maybe they'd be back in Olympia asking for more money, or maybe they'd be laying people off. So the question was, did they overpromise? Could they sustain those raises? Then in October, the Supreme Court weighed in on the state's death penalty statute and ruled it unconstitutional. In the fall elections, Democrats picked up seats in both chambers, while Republicans managed to hold on in a couple of squeaker elections. Democrats will now have a 57 to 41 seat advantage in the House and a 28 to 21 seat advantage in the state Senate. In the Senate, Democrat Tim Sheldon from Mason County caucuses with the Republicans, so I count him as one of theirs, but he identifies as a Democrat. We'll have 28 new state lawmakers this year, a large number of new legislators, including 2 first-generation Vietnamese Americans, the first Native American woman to serve in the state House. Needless to say, Washington's legislature will be more diverse this year. Women will make up 41% of the state legislature. That is we haven't seen that since 2000. Lawmakers. So this year, for 2019, lawmakers are meeting in a longer budget writing session, 105 days. As they convene, the economy is turning right along. State revenues are expected to be up in this next 2-year biennium by about $4 billion over the current 2-year budget. But Governor Jay Inslee is already saying that the state's needs, the state's spending obligations, are going to outstrip that new revenue coming in. So he, in December, proposed about a $55 billion 2-year budget, which represents a 20+% increase over current spending, about $10 billion in spending over the current budget. For the first time, the state budget in Washington State is expected to go over $50 billion. The governor says $4 billion of the extra $10 billion he wants to spend is about McCleary obligation. You can think of this next 2-year budget as the first time the state is actually paying the full freight on public education. In addition, there's $1 billion to move K-12 employees into a new state-run healthcare system. That's a big ticket item. The governor's proposing to spend about $700 million on state employee pay raises, collectively bargained through their unions, and about $675 million in his operating and capital budget on mental health, which will, by the way, be one of the top issues in this upcoming session, and we'll be talking about that. Inslee wants to pay for some of this new spending by imposing a new capital gains tax and also imposing a higher B&O rate on services. We're already hearing Republicans and even some Democrats saying this may be too much, too soon, too fast. We're also hearing some people say that maybe with a lot of money rolling into the state coffers, we should be talking about tax cuts, not tax hikes. So what else is on the table? Of course, voters in Washington turned down a carbon tax initiative in November. the governor has now moved away from that idea of taxing carbon, and instead he's got a new approach to trying to combat climate change and reduce state carbon emissions. Lawmakers are going to be asked to consider 2 initiatives to the legislature. One is a car tabs measure from Tim Eyman, and one is a repeal of the state's de facto ban or prohibition on affirmative action. Other topics on the agenda: a public health insurance option, special education funding, homelessness, Orca recovery. We're likely to see a statewide plastic bag ban push, a limit on magazine capacity on firearms, and another run at increasing the smoking age to 21. And finally, 2 wild cards this session. This is the last year the Speaker of the House, Frank Chop, will be the Speaker of the House. He is the longest-serving Speaker in the state. He announced he'll step down at the end of this session, which means that Democrats would elect a new Speaker for next year. One political observer predicted that this will be an activist session, historic, broad, multifaceted, in part because it is Frank's last. And also, Governor Inslee is a likely candidate for president. And that will certainly loom over this session as he looks for political wins and starts to visit early primary and caucus states. And on that note, I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Essex Porter.
All right, time to introduce our panelists. And first, Representative J.T. Wilcox is the House Republican leader. He's from Yelm, represents the 2nd Legislative District in parts of Pierce and Thurston County. The Wilcox name is familiar to most all of us who go to the grocery store, see the egg section. That's the Wilcox family business, and Representative Wilcox told me a few weeks ago that he is now welcoming a 5th generation Wilcox into the family business. This will be his 9th year in the House. Democrat Larry Springer is the House Deputy Majority Leader. He operates a wine shop and wine bar in Kirkland, served 4 years as mayor of Kirkland, and was elected to serve the 45th District in the legislature in 2004. Senator Mark Schoesler is the Senate Republican leader. He represents the 9th District in Southwest Washington. He is a 5th-generation dryland wheat farmer. His place is near Ritzville, and he has served 25 years in the House and Senate. Democrat Andy Billig is Senate Majority Leader. He represents the 3rd District in Spokane. He's co-owner and former general manager of the Spokane Indians baseball team, elected to the legislature in 2012, and he is the only Democratic senator elected from east of the mountains. And a little bit on how we're going to proceed this morning. Austin and I will start off with some questions of the candidates. We'll talk about some of the big issues, and later we'll go through some things and ask them for some rapid responses. But most importantly, we ask you to participate with questions of your own. So you see the cards on your table there. Please write your questions on one of those cards at the center of your table. Please include your name on the card as you write your question. Staff and volunteers will be around to pick them up in about 20 minutes. And let's give our panelists kind of an opening question so they can set the stage as they're seeing the legislature this year. Just take a minute and tell us what, say, 2 pieces of bills or legislation should absolutely pass this session, and what one piece, what one idea really even shouldn't see the light of day. And we'll just go down the row. We'll start with Representative Wilcox.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks all of you for having us, and appreciate those eggs for breakfast. You know, I think there's 2 really major issues that there's a lot of broad agreement on. It may be that we have some different solutions, whether it happens to be in a more densely urban area or a small city or a small town. But certainly homelessness and the things that are associated with that, like affordable housing, housing supply, the ability to build easily and efficiently and at low cost are critical. And we also know I would imagine that there's hardly a person here who doesn't have a family member or a close friend who has had to deal with addiction. And I think we have less broad agreement with how to address that, and to what extent does the safety and security of the local community have to do with the ways that we address that. But I think every single person sincerely wishes to protect all of us from what is happening, and it's a sad thing. These are also things that unify, I think, both parties and people in their communities, regardless of the size. Now, as far as I shouldn't see the light of day, it turns out I'm a Republican, and so most of these tax proposals, or maybe all of them, we are not going to be real friendly towards. We think that the rate of growth that we're seeing in state government, which is already at record levels, actually endangers the programs that most people want to fund the most. And I've seen this happen before because I came in right at the end of the Great Recession. And as a result of unconstrained spending in the earlier years, we had a disaster for people that needed the help from the state.
And real quick, is there a particular piece of legislation you absolutely want to see pass? Piece of legislation you want to be sure?
Yeah, absolutely. It would be a series of bills, probably highlighted by my seatmate Andrew Barkas, that he will be dropping soon regarding homelessness and keeping people in their homes.
Okay. Representative Springer?
So thank you, Essex, and good morning, everyone. I would prefer these be lunch meetings because you can have wine at lunch.
You can have eggs too.
So I concur with JT's comment in terms of really what must pass this time, and that's the legislation certainly around housing and homelessness issues, as well as behavioral health and the opioid crisis. That's a part of that. I would extend that to a couple of other areas as well. I think we need to make some steps toward dealing with climate change. There are a number of bills that will probably be introduced around the issue of climate change. I'm not going to suggest that we get on board with any one of them in particular, although the one that I'm most interested in is the 100% fossil-free energy production bill that we almost passed last year, so hopefully we can find a solution there. I think the other thing that is important is that we sort of fill in the holes that's left by the McCleary decision, and the major one is around special ed funding. I think the legislature recognizes that while we have met our McCleary obligation according to the Supreme Court, we really haven't met our obligation to fully fund special education. And that's a complicated issue because there are levels of acuity of student need, and we don't recognize that acuity when we create a formula. So I think we're going to work hard on that. Something that should not pass, should not see the light of day, seems perennially there's a bill to split the state and create a 51st state. I don't know why that keeps coming up, but it does, and it should just never see the light of day. We really believe that there is one Washington and only one Washington, and it ought to stay that way.
Senator Schoesler.
Thank you, Essex. I can't believe there are no bread products on the table.
Okay, we've all hyped our business now.
If it was lunchtime, we could have it with Larry's wine, but we should have a bread product. You know what? For those of you that may have seen the AP forum yesterday, I think that what really must pass, I don't think there is a bill that works on housing affordability or a bill that does everything that we would like to get to with mental health. There simply is not a bill for either one. We've seen strong agreement on every one of these panels that I've been at for the last month that, for example, Senator Billig and I start sounding a lot alike on priorities. We just disagree on how we're going to get there. As far as what shouldn't see the light of day, new and higher taxes, especially any version of a state income tax.
Okay. Senator Billig, I don't know if you have a contribution to the food groups.
No, but I appreciate everybody highlighting what they do in their other jobs. And what I was going to say is that I wish we could have this meeting at a baseball stadium while we're watching a baseball game.
That's okay.
So, you know, the biggest bill that we work on each year is the operating budget. And so what the bill that I want to make sure passes is a responsible, balanced operating budget that invests in our state, invests in building opportunity and prosperity for everyone in Washington State. The second one is much harder because there's so many priorities in education, in environment, in healthcare. And I was going to say special education, but to not be repetitive, I'll pick another bill that maybe you haven't heard about, the Long-Term Care Trust Act. And this is, we have an age wave in our country, in our state. And the Long-Term Care Trust Act, which has bipartisan support, would create basically a benefit for people in Washington State to pay for 1 year in supported living, assisted living. And so mostly for people that are aging, but it could also be for somebody that has needs assistance for an injury, for a traumatic brain injury or for a chronic disease. And I think the bill was around last year. A lot of good work was done over the interim. Senator Palumbo, Senator Cleveland are working on that, and I think it has a good chance to pass. We'd be the first in the nation to do this, and I think it'd be not only great for quality of life for all of us and for our aging population, but also good fiscal sense for our state. So hopefully that passes.
All right, thank you all.
Well, let's stick with the budget for a moment, and I'll start with you, Senator Billig. The governor's problem statement, in essence, is that we are a rapidly growing state on track to be 9 million people by 2040, that we're now fully paying the freight on public education, and that's more than 50% of the budget, that there are long overdue bills on, especially around mental health and social services. I mean, things that get really into the weeds, like raising the reimbursement rates for the service providers in the child welfare system, for instance. And that while the economy is doing well and while there's all this new money coming in, for a state of our size with the problems that we have, taxes are going to be needed, and that growing the budget significantly by 20+% in the next 2 years is what needs to happen to be responsible, to be moral, to be constitutional. So that's in essence his problem statement. I want to hear from each of you, starting with you, Senator Billig. As you look at this budget, what is the problem statement, and is the governor proposing to spend too much, too little, or has he hit kind of a Goldilocks just right spot?
Well, there's a lot there. You know, one of the things that surprised me when I came into state government after having run a business for 20 years at that point, was how we think short-term in our budgeting. And it's the way the system is set up. We do a 2-year budget with a 4-year outlook, and that's actually better than most states do to look that far ahead. But really, when you're investing, you want to look at a much longer time horizon than just 2 or 4 years. And we don't, because we don't get to book a savings that's further out. So we have to balance a budget. That's a requirement. Unlike the federal government, we can't print money and have a deficit budget. So we make those decisions short term. If we were to make long-term decisions and be able to look out and say, what's the best for the state in the long term? I said it yesterday in the forum. We're going to own the state of Washington forever. So we should be thinking on a longer time horizon. And things like mental health certainly is an upstream investment that saves us money. Early learning is probably the best investment that we can do, because we know when we put money into early learning, it not only improves quality of life, but it actually saves us money. So to me, the problem, the challenge, is to be able to look further, even if we can't book the savings initially in the sort of accounting structure that we have, but be able to make the case with data to say, this is going to cost us $1 now, and we may even have to raise that $1 now in new revenue. But that's the smart thing to do, because we know it's going to return us $10 in the long term. And I think that's our challenge, is to change our thinking, to think longer term, and make the smart investments for the people of Washington State, both for the quality of life and for the fiscal return for the taxpayers.
A 20% jump in state spending in 2 years?
Well, I don't look at it as whether it's 1% or 20% or a decrease of 5%. It's about what are the quality investments. I don't think there's a specific number that we should be focused on hitting. I think it's that we should be focused on making the smart investments, like in healthcare and in education, that will pay off for us.
Okay. Senator Schoesler.
Well, I think there's the real budget, which was released at the 11th hour, known as Book One, that shows real priorities. But I think what we have is a fantasy budget. This fantasy budget starts with a 62% increase in the governor's office, 23% in the lieutenant governor's office, sort of like opening the catalog and everybody gets what they want. But the reality of it is, we are growing by billions in revenue. And just November, actual collections were up well over $100 million. It boils down to prioritization like every family meets with, prioritization that every small business deals with, and I think just about any business or family I talk to thinks that 10% with doing nothing is pretty good, except we're looking at 20% with new and higher taxes, not investments, it's spending, it's not revenue, it's taxes. So you get away from that, it's living within your means and prioritization.
Representative Springer.
So we
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So we have this debate every year. The process we use in Olympia is the governor's required to release a budget. He did that. It's where we start. Now the House and the Senate will go to work and they'll release their budgets, and hopefully by the 105th day, we will have an agreement on a final budget that incorporates pieces of all three of those. So the notion that we should take the very first budget out of the gate as where we're headed ultimately is just not accurate. There are some things in there that we will all adhere to because they're good ideas. But I want to just put some perspective on our budget here, because you hear a lot about the revenue growth that we have had, and it is true. We have had some really good revenue growth lately. If you look at our budget out 4 years from right now, it balances without doing a thing, because we've got new revenue coming in. It balances. We even have a little ending fund balance, a couple $100 million, which is not a lot in a $50 billion budget, but it's at least a balance. We don't have a deficit. Looks good. However, to get to that number, you don't spend a dime on Orcas, you don't spend a dime on mental health, you don't spend a dime on housing, you don't spend a dime on transportation, you don't spend a dime on climate change, you don't spend anything on any of those issues that I think most of us in this room recognize are things that we do need to spend some time at. So the notion that that over a 4-year period our budget growth will take care of the needs of this state, I don't happen to agree with. I don't think my caucus does either. Now, do we want to spend a 25 or 30% increase? Perhaps not. But at the end of the day, we're going to pick and choose from that list of stuff I just listed off and figure out how we address those through our budget. And that probably will mean some additional revenue. We can then all argue about where that should come from and how much it should be, but that's the nature of the budget argument that we'll have. So,
Representative Wilcox.
Well, thank you. And it's a little hard to be original when you're number 4 in line on the same question. But, when you're in the minority, you have to pick your spots. And really what you have is a bully pulpit. And I think even though Washington at this point is a one-party state, the minority party has a responsibility to be heard. And I always go back to the first moments that I spent in the legislature 8 years ago, I think it was, or 9, something like that. We were coming towards the worst part of the Great Recession. I was the only freshman on what was called House Ways and Means then. We had had exactly the same budget discussion a few years in advance. We had created a bunch of new programs. We had negotiated much higher labor contracts. We had reduced tuition in some places. And what happened? The very first vote that I took in Olympia was the biggest all-cuts supplemental budget that had ever been passed. And by the way, that wasn't Republicans doing that. That was also single-party government. That was Democrats adjusting a Democrat budget. And we don't want to do that. I don't think that anybody in either party wants to go through the exercise one more time of hurting the people that need help the most. And that's what happens when you are irresponsible with budgets. And there's no individual, I think, that is is irresponsible. It's a process problem, and we're going to see that again this time, because there is no, of the 3 budgets that come out, there is no budget that is being produced by a group that is incentivized to be the low budget. We've had a good process over the last 5 years because the governor's gone high, the House Democrats have gone high, maybe higher than they wanted for bargaining purposes, and the Senate Republicans went low, maybe lower than they wanted for negotiating purposes. We all knew that we were going to end up in a good place in the middle, and I think it was very responsible for the state. But there's nobody that now can really stand up to their own constituents and constituencies and start low. So I think we're looking at not responsible budgeting, but accelerating spending that will hurt us later.
Representative Wilcox, we'll stick with you for a second. You were outlining what you had to do your first term with those cuts. There are those who would say that's an argument for adding a revenue stream to Washington State, and they point to the capital gains tax. Wouldn't it be good, now that there is some prosperity, to add an additional revenue stream that might help out when we have the eventual downturn?
Well, I'm glad that you asked that, because I think there's a good answer to that. When do you get the maximum revenue from a capital gains income tax? You get it at maximum asset values. So you have the incentive to spend the maximum amount of money at the peak economic point. And when does that capital gains income tax revenue fall off the most? When the economy tanks. So it actually sets us up for exactly the situation that I was talking about.
Yeah. Representative Springer, it looks like you wanted to get in here.
So, at the risk of boring anyone in the audience who's heard me say this every year for the last 5 or 6 years, I'm going to say it again. It is indisputable. Washington State has the most regressive tax system in the nation. Some would argue that we're number 2 because Tennessee edged us out. Whatever. And the problem that creates for us when we start budgeting and we list those things that are priorities that we want to spend money on, we look for a revenue source because the current revenue source doesn't meet that. When you do it that way, where you pick pieces of the revenue puzzle and try and run that up the flagpole all by itself, the voters don't like that very much. And for good reason. There's no guarantee to them that if you run a capital gains tax up, or in the past we've tried income taxes in the past, that you just won't keep raising other stuff anyway. So my suggestion has always been to, I don't know, go to the University of Washington, ask Anna Marie Kelsey to find 5 smart people, put them in a room, and tell them to do one job. And that is, from scratch, build, design, the most progressive tax system you can come up with that raises, just pick a number, $50 billion every 2 years. What would that tax system look like? And I can tell you about what it would look like. Idaho. It would look like Idaho's tax system. NPR had an article about 2 years ago that if Washington State adopted Idaho's tax system, which includes capital gains, income, corporate tax, sales tax, property tax, we would raise $10 billion more per biennium than we do right now. That's a staggering number. And our problem is trying to get to that comprehensive redo of our entire tax system is really difficult. And I think, personally, I think it probably has to come from outside the legislature. But until we do that, we'll be having this argument time and time again. So.
Well, as we move down the table, let's add a layer to this. There's the conversation around, should we have new sources of revenue or taxes, like a capital gains tax? Should the focus be on bringing in new dollars so you can spend them, or on trying to address the regressivity of our tax structure? And therefore, if you're going to create a new tax for high-income earners, should you be lowering taxes at the same time, maybe a sales tax cut or a property tax cut? And then, what about the idea that if there's a lot of new money in state coffers, maybe it's time to actually send some of that money back to taxpayers? Should there, in fact, be tax cuts across the board? Senator Schoesler, what are your thoughts on tax reform, tax cuts, tax hikes?
Well, let's look at the facts. for 7 years, we have seen huge tax increase proposals annually. That's a fact. We have seen proposals for versions of an income tax, but no one wants to put it in the Constitution. Our gas tax is in the Constitution that it can't be spent anyplace else, and the voters have accepted the gas tax as a transportation package. What we haven't seen is any offers of relief to hardworking taxpayers that are always referenced in this debate. Only the Washington Policy Center has seriously proposed cutting sales taxes, which are supposedly very regressive. It's not on the table. Car taxes, those car tabs for ST3 and others hit lower income people harder than wealthy. Even one-party rule couldn't pass any relief to car tabs. So until we get serious about actually giving tax relief in any of these areas, it's all about new and higher taxes and more spending.
And Senator Billig, it seems like it's very hard to have the tax reform question discussion and debate and have that be bipartisan. Representative Springer is sort of suggesting, could we develop a whole new tax structure? You can't really have that conversation. At the same time, you're saying we need to impose new taxes to bring in new revenue to pay for our obligations. Those are two separate conversations. Yeah. So help pull that apart. Which of those conversations do you want to have in 2019?
Well, I think they can be combined, but first I just want to address this idea about nobody's talking about tax relief. The Democrats came in and took control of the Senate last year, and one of the significant things that we did was to reduce property taxes. We had the money coming in from the state property tax was set up the year before as part of the McCleary decision. There was some excess funding that we didn't need, and we returned that to the taxpayers in a cut for 2019. So there is, where it makes sense, where we can do it, where it, I think that there is a bipartisan interest in reducing where we can, especially where it's related to fairness. I think that it can be together talking about new revenue for smart investments and also fairness. And I'm really encouraged that this year, it seems like we do have an agreement on a lot of things on what the problem is. There have been lots of years where we couldn't even agree on what the problem is. And the discussion about tax fairness and the Washington Policy Center and other Republicans talking about tax fairness is great. The sales tax reduction, which would be, I think, a positive step because that is a regressive tax. But if we really want to invest in fairness, there are better ways to do that. And the working families tax credit would actually be less expensive than a sales tax cut and have a bigger impact on tax fairness. So you could say, we're going to create this new revenue source. We're going to invest in a working families tax credit. It's going to help low-income families, and it's going to help fix our very regressive tax code, and take a portion of the proceeds of the new revenue and invest in really smart programs that are going to pay off in the long term.
What about, you mentioned property taxes, and you mentioned a property tax cut, and which we will get our bill starting next month, but for those of us who live around here, the property tax increase was 20% or more. So, and school districts are saying the way that the formulas work, school districts around here are saying they still didn't get the money that they need not only to pay teachers, but to shrink class sizes and, of course, special ed. So now those districts are going out for levies. What's the rule going to be on levies? Are you going to change things so that school districts can set the levies a little higher for those things that are not basic education? And Senator Billig, why don't I start with you and then Senator Schoesler?
Yeah, I think there will be proposals to raise the levy limits, and I don't know if there's going to be support in the legislature for that, but I think that there is going to be a discussion of that. And one of the things when you talk about our system of education in Washington State is decentralized. It is 295 different school districts with locally elected school boards. And I believe that system of local control is good because it's those citizens and those school board members that the citizens are electing that know their communities the best. And I think that's the principle with levies at whatever level they are, is that you let the local community decide. But the key is what can that money be used for? And that is the crux of the McCleary decision, was not how much money is there, but that the state needs to be paying for basic education salaries, and any local levy money has to be used for enhancements. And if we do any changes in the levy limits, I think we have to pair it with very strict language to make sure that that levy funding is not used for the basic ed salaries, because that will just get us back into the same problem that we were before. But if a local community wants to raise money to invest in, in the Spokane School District, the district pays for every kid to take the SATs, and they use levy monies for that. And that's been a really big program. That's great. A lot of districts are using levy money for early learning. That's a great investment for our state and for our community. They use it for sports or after-school programs. I think that should be a local decision on how they do that.
Senator Schoesler?
I think it is. Didn't we learn anything? It was the Seattle levy failure in the 70s that led to the Dorn decision for basic ed funding. Then we repeated it with what became McCleary. Why on earth would we go back down that road again? And if you increase funding and you don't put fences around how it's going to be spent, it can be bargained away before it ever gets to special ed or SATs or anything else. So you only make the problem worse down the road if you don't learn from the mistakes of the past. I think if we look at the men and women from all four caucuses that negotiated McCleary, they wanted a tight package of what that could be used for, that we wouldn't violate the Supreme Court a third time. And if we go down this road, we risk violating the Supreme Court and ending right back where we've been twice in my lifetime.
And the point you're making is it not only violates a Supreme Court ruling if basic education is not funded, it also violates it if there was wide disparity between school districts in the state, because some school districts can raise a lot more tax levy money than others.
Well, absolutely. That's what's led to it over the years, is a wide disparity in value per student creates a very inequitable situation. Why would we repeat that yet again? We need to learn from our mistakes and not repeat them.
Representative Wilcox, it's not just the urban, suburban school districts that are talking about still not getting enough money to do what they need to do.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, because in the discussion that we're having, there is a big difference. And in some ways, it's more critical in the Puget Sound area. People think that, this is an east versus west state. I think that's not really the divide. The divide, is the central Puget Sound area that is so wealthy, and the rest of the state that mostly lags behind. And I know most of this audience is from Seattle, and I'd just like to ask you to, for a moment, put yourself in the shoes of parents and homeowners that live in not very far away from here, in parts of the state that doesn't have very much, if any, commercial property value. That's what really differentiates tax rates. And many of these much less wealthy areas are just on the fringes of sound transit. And these places have now, for the average homeowner that is struggling, have been crushed with a whole new series of ST3 taxes. And I'm not sure those districts will ever pass another levy. I've refused to vote for bills that allowed greater taxing authority for transit, for example, although I'm not anti-transit when they're trying to spread it to rural areas, because in my mind, we have to give people the capacity to vote for school levies first. That has to be the first priority. And what we are poised to do, I'm afraid, right now, is set up a system where, just a few miles away, because there's a lot of commercial property, you can have a school district that easily passes levies that actually are at somewhat low rates, and those kids are benefiting from 30% or something like that more dollars than kids across the street that are unfortunate in some ways to live in a place that doesn't have that value, and whose taxpayers, who have the same heart and they care about their kids the same amount, just don't have the ability to fund that. And I hope we don't go there.
Representative Springer, quick thoughts?
No.
Okay.
The only thing I would mention, I guess, is because, as Senator Billig said, we have 295 school districts, all with separately elected boards of directors. It creates a kind of a mosaic of programs and services that each community really wants to promote. And I would agree that that's a good system until you come to the question of what is the baseline that every single student in this state should achieve before they get out of high school, whether they're from Chewelah or Hoquiam or Seattle. And that system kind of starts to break down there. So we've tried to figure out how the state should step in. That was what McCleary was all about. I tried to do some really mind-numbing math around levy rates and the impact on average households in the state, and it is complicated. But one of the things I try to do, and we're going to spend some more time at it this coming session, is if you raise a levy by 2 points in Ritzville,
Over here, yeah.
Ritzville, and you raise it in Bellevue, it raises different amounts of money. That's a given because the property values in Ritzville are different than they are in Bellevue. So then I tried to figure out what's the average impact per household in those two districts and what percentage is that increase of the area median income. It's a pretty interesting picture. It paints one that makes it a little less unfair than what absolutely meets the eye at the beginning. I don't want to get into the weeds there. It'll make your eyes bleed. But it's a topic I think we've got to talk more about because there is a huge disparity, as JT and Mark mentioned, between urban and rural. It's really not east and west, it's urban and rural.
I'm sorry. Let's get a couple of you just on climate change, and we'll try to speed things up a little bit. So climate change is going to be a huge issue for Governor Inslee. It seems to be what he is building a potential presidential run on. He has a long list of items of climate change. One of them, where consumers might see a cost almost immediately, would be the clean fuel standards. But first for you, Representative Wilcox, among those things that would affect climate change, is there something that you think you and your caucus would get on board with?
Well, I am really looking forward to the next couple of weeks when Richard DeBolt, someone who's worked in the energy world, Representative Richard DeBolt, is unveiling his climate package, and I think it's going to get a lot of attention. I know that he's talked with the governor about this, and I want to give the governor credit too. Governor Gregoire came out to the farm to talk about carbon. Oops, I'm sorry, that was Governor Inslee. Sorry, Trudy. This is an inside joke, by the way. And I know that he's sincere about this. One more time, this is a little bit about people that don't have to drive very far, have lots of transit options, and people that aren't fortunate to live close to where they work. And most of the plans that we see create way more cost for the people that can afford it the least. And so you see a lot of resistance from Republicans on that. On the other hand, we've got some great areas where we could have mutual agreement. We believe in incentives, of course. We have a great industry here in the state of Washington that sequesters more carbon, and I wish that we talked more about subtracting carbon because that should be just as valid. A ton of carbon additionally sequestered should be as big a deal as not emitting it, and I think Republicans...
I will cut you off here. When you say a great industry that helps sequester carbon,
so
you mean the forest industry.
The forestry industry. And we also, in big parts of Western Washington, have a lot of, marginal and unused farmland. And I would love in a big way to increase the acreage of forest land that we have in this state. And it would be great if those small landowners could take advantage of the social value that they are producing by sequestering carbon on their currently idle farmland.
Senator Billig, anything you see from the governor's package or other climate change things you see actually passing the legislature?
Well, I really compliment the governor on his bold proposal. And one of the things that I like is that he's put out a whole suite of ideas, and you add in a few other legislative initiatives. And I don't know that we're going to get everything passed, but I think we will get some big items passed. And when you go out and talk, when I go out and talk to citizens, I mean, there are certain issues that really resonate: education, affordable health care, and then clean air, clean water. I mean, those things just, people get that. They care about their natural resources, about and about the environment, and they care about the climate. And we have a ability in Washington State not only to make impact for our state, but we've done this in a whole host of areas where we as a state can take a leadership position. It's one of the reasons I'm actually excited if Governor Inslee runs for president, because it's going to put a spotlight on all of the amazing things that we're doing in Washington State.
But is there one thing you think will pass?
So the sort of the leading things that I think have the best chance and I think can have a really big impact: the 100% renewable, the electric vehicle initiatives. There's a suite of bills related to protecting orcas and salmon, and the plastics bill. And the last one is there's going to be a package of oil transport safety bills. I think all of those are vital for the environment. I think they all have a decent chance to pass.
Thanks.
Let's move on to mental health, which is, I think, been teed up as sort of a signature issue for this session. Last night on the PBS NewsHour, a Vancouver, Washington mom named Jerry Clark had about a 4 or 5 minute segment, first-person segment, where she told the story of her son who went off to college. He was a debate champion and had a mental health crisis, and the struggle her family has gone through. Struggle is an understatement. I was involved in helping to set that up. I've done a lot of reporting, and my email inbox since that story aired last night at the end of PBS NewsHour is dozens of emails from families saying this is the struggle they're living. Their kids grow up, they become adults, they're emancipated, and until your child is ready to jump off the I-5 bridge into the Columbia River, or until your child gets picked up by the police and is in jail, you can't get help. And so, Senator Schoesler, I know you're in the minority, but I'm going to start with you since we haven't started with you, I think, in terms of a question. What can this legislature do for families like Jerry Clark and others who are struggling with a system that they say is wholly inadequate to take care of their loved ones?
Well, as I said in my opening remarks yesterday and today, I think this is an area we agree on a lot. There's a lot of things we can do. Senator Becker has pointed out the ability to use telemedicine for mental health. There's not a single psychiatrist in Whitman County, but with telemedicine, you can provide that. If you go to many areas of the state, it's difficult to get that service. Telemedicine is one of the tools that we can afford and give quality to those families. Yesterday, I think one of my colleagues pointed out the need for professionals to help. I think we need to go back and look again at the ability to further increase the utilization of mid-level providers for this, like we do in general medicine, that we get there. And I think there's the days of the large institutions for everybody are probably not the future. It's going to be different. It may be nonprofits, hospitals, private sector providing service in a different model. And I think that's one of the things that I see a lot of interest on. We saw it in my district with Tyler Helsinki last spring at WSU, a young man with the whole world in front of him. He's going to be the quarterback of the air raid offense. And he took his own life. And I think those bring it home to all of us that this is something we want to do. We want to do it together, and we want to do it smart.
Representative Springer.
A couple of thoughts. Identifying potential mental health or emotional issues early is obviously a really big key. We all know that intuitively, that the sooner you recognize that someone is struggling, the better. That often can start in school. And one of the things that we have looked at as perhaps an inadequate service in our public school systems is the amount of counseling hours that are provided to school districts. We all know and read the stories of tragic events that, if you trace them backwards, can often end up at a time back in school when there was either cyberbullying going on or actually physical bullying going on. And I don't think we currently staff our schools with the kind of counseling help that can identify that soon enough and get some help. Now, assuming you can identify that earlier, then what? And I think Mark is right. The era of institutionalizing people with mental health problems is a thing of the past. It's really clear that the road to recovery, whether it's mental health or even in the criminal justice system and rehabilitation, works better when those systems are close to home, in the community where your family is, rather than shipped off to Western State or Walla Walla Prison if you have a felony in Seattle. So the whole notion is, let's make a greater investment in our community-based organizations, community mental health centers, as Mark just mentioned. So I think that's the direction, that's the model we're probably moving toward.
We want to move on to our rapid response topics, but I want to give the other two panelists just a chance, just if you could, I know it's a complicated topic, but just in a couple of sentences on mental health, what you think can be accomplished in the 2019 session. But please be brief, even though I know it's a complicated topic.
Yes, I'll be brief. One thing I just wanted to mention, that because it is a focus and a bipartisan focus, as we've reorganized the Senate this year, we've created a standing subcommittee specifically to talk about behavioral health. Senator Dingra is going to be the chair of that committee, and she has a lot of experience in that. So it provides a venue for us to really focus on it in the Senate. You know, I'll try not to I'll make one point to not be repetitive, is to look at another angle, which is our investments in smart justice can really help as related to mental health treatment and success. The sheriff in Spokane likes to say that the largest mental health facility in Spokane is the jail. And that's not productive for anyone. That's expensive, that's not good for the individuals there, that's not good for our community in terms of public safety. And so to the extent that we can identify people that are having criminal problems but really the root of the cause is a mental health problem, and have those people not go to jail, but go get treatment because we have these community resources, and that we can actually divert them either upon arrest or upon sentencing and get them the treatment they need to actually address the root cause and have these upstream solutions could be very effective. So one of the things that's encouraging, I think, from hearing all these responses is that there are a lot of different possible solutions, and I think if we can do several of them this year, we can make real progress.
Yeah. And besides the plea of families, there are courts saying you have to do something. Yeah. Again, Representative Wilcox, just briefly.
Thank you. You know, it's a three-cornered stool in a lot of ways. We have the legislature that can provide capital and operating dollars, and on the operating side, we have continually been pouring more money into this. The legislature can do policy, and we've got three people, Senator Oban, Senator Darneal, Representative Jenkins, Republicans and Democrats with a ton of expertise in this. We've got 147 representatives and senators that agree that this is important. And the third part is, and actually the House and Senate probably has the easy part. The executive branch has the tough part, and that is creating policies and executing on a plan. And I really hope that, and I trust that he will, that the governor will make this among his top priorities to bring in the absolute best management that he can and maintain focus, so that in spite of the inputs that have been continually added to this, we have the most professional possible execution.
Okay. Let's do some of our rapid response questions, and we're really just looking for a sentence, maybe a sentence and a half answer here. And as you know, and as the clock ticks, we will Maybe get to 3 or 4 of these. First response question. Repeal of I-200, which was a ban on affirmative action. Should the legislature take action on what is now I-1000 to repeal I-200, or just let it go to the ballot? Senator Billig, let's start with you.
Hate to punt on the first one, but we have not had a lot of discussion on that. So that's as a caucus, and I think as a legislature, we need to talk about that. When a initiative comes to the legislature, we obviously have the option to act or to not act. So it will probably go to the voters either way, and I just don't have an answer yet because we haven't even started the session.
Senator Schoesler.
I think we should consider our constitutional alternative to put an alternative measure on the ballot, since initiatives can't easily be amended.
Representative Springer.
Agreed.
Representative Wilcox.
I've had impressive people from both sides of that in my office in the last week. I want to study this more before I have an opinion that I can express.
Okay.
I-976 is the Tim Eyman, once again, $30 car tab measure. Same deal. You can pass it, you can let it go to the ballot, you can pass an alternative and send them both to the ballot. Senator Schoesler, what should you do on 976? Again, assuming both of these are certified to the legislature. They haven't yet been.
Pass an alternative.
Pass the alternative. Interesting. Representative Springer.
I would agree we should pass an alternative, but I won't miss this opportunity to indicate that we are facing in this particular initiative for Mr. Eyman a absolute all-out assault on the democratic process in this state that would allow an entire state to vote whether or not a smaller group of people have the right to tax themselves. That is a bad road to start down. So I hope we put together an alternative.
Representative Wilcox.
I think we could come up with a good alternative.
Okay. Senator Billig.
I think we should find an alternative. I mean, one of the things when we talk about this goes directly to revenue. And while it may be revenue in one specific area or another, we're talking about things. I mean, we have all this broad agreement on mental health, on how all these great things we're going to do to help people in our state, and it makes so much sense. Guess what? We've got to pay for it. And if we start passing all of these programmed initiatives that take revenue away, we've got no chance to make these really smart investments that we obviously all agree on.
Okay.
Do you support a public health insurance option as proposed by Governor Inslee? And Representative Springer, I think you start.
I don't know yet. I do know that that's a topic that has come up a number of times over the years, and that is, how do we adequately fund a healthcare system that gives equal access to every single Washingtonian? We've kind of tinkered with that with Apple Health for Kids, that put 60 or 70,000 low-income kids on health care. We paid for that out of the state. Some system that invests tax dollars, wherever those come from, into a healthcare system that assures that every single Washingtonian is adequately covered and doesn't lose their house because they fell off a ladder, is essential. Now, whether it's called that or called something else, or depends on a certain revenue stream, I'm not prepared to answer that question just yet.
Okay. Representative Wilcox.
No, and there's a ton of innovation out in the private sector now, not necessarily from the healthcare world, but from the technology world, and we should give that a few years to develop before we squash it again.
Senator Billig.
I haven't studied all the details of the governor's proposal, but I strongly support any proposal that's going to create more options, more access to affordable health care for the people of Washington State, particularly in the counties where there are very few choices of health plans, and a public option certainly falls in the category of helping to provide more options for affordable health care for the people of Washington State.
And Senator Schoesler.
Short answer is no. I'm sure you're surprised. But this is placed under the Healthcare Authority. They're running deficits over $100 million, and we're going to empower them to be in a bigger insurance company yet. And I just think the Healthcare Authority has to get their fiscal house in order before we would even consider giving them any additional responsibility.
What is one thing the 2019 legislature could do for the higher education system in the state, for families sending their kids to four-year and community colleges? Representative Wilcox.
Well, you got me in a policy area that I've never worked in.
That's okay. You can pass too.
Yeah, no, but I will say one thing briefly. We have a lot of different sources of education right now, and in general, we only talk about our four-year state institutions. We need to continually recognize the capacity that we have in our private colleges and universities, and we all think that we've got great opportunities in technical education as well. Let's not forget those.
So it's an area that I hope the 2019 legislature really focuses on. We have been so consumed by McCleary and our K-12 system for the last several years that we have really robbed Peter to pay Paul, and the loser in that has been our higher ed system. If you have the greatest K-12 system in the world and that's it, you have not done your job. So we need to, I think, refocus on higher ed in a couple of areas. One, we should make sure that in a very short period of time, the state need grant, which is college tuition and assistance for low-income kids in this state, is fully funded. We're on a pace to do that. And we should also recognize, and I think the legislature is moving in this direction, we should recognize that an adequate post-secondary education does not necessarily always mean a four-year baccalaureate degree. We have one of the best community college systems in the nation. They're nimble, they're quick, and we should rely on that and fully fund that and make sure that every kid in this state has that opportunity.
State Senator from the district that includes Washington State University.
Go Cougs. You know, I think the legislature has given collective bargaining to the employees of our community colleges, and they bargain against student tuition money with no means to pay for it. I think that's a big change in our community college system. In our 4 years, they bargain against the universities with no way to pay for it. Case in point, UW was handed a $50 million bill from collective bargaining with no money. So I think giving those four-year and community colleges relief from that bargaining or the money to pay for it would be one of the best things we could do.
I've been able to see the higher ed system from a different perspective this year, as my daughter is a freshman at the University of Washington, and I've been so impressed. I've been impressed with our state institutions, but it's been a great experience to see the university from that perspective. I think the biggest thing that we can do to help with higher ed is to expand the state need grant, to fulfill our promise to fully fund it, and then to expand it. The state need grant is the primary tool that we have to help low-income kids to achieve that dream of going to college, and it's one of the best things we can do to help break the cycle of poverty we see in so many communities in our state.
Final question of specific interest right here in the city limits of Seattle. Senator Billig, we'll start with you. There's a proposal for a state law to ban a congestion fee in the city of Seattle. What do you think?
I think that, my default position is always that local communities should be able to make the decisions that impact their communities. Sometimes there is a reason why the state should take action to prevent a local decision, but this is not one of those cases, and I think the local community should decide what they want to do.
Senator Schoesler?
I'm not familiar with the term congestion fee and how it would be
This would be
imposed.
something that's similar. You've maybe seen in the headlines, the City of London has a fee for driving into downtown London, and you pay extra if you're actually going to drive because they want to keep cars out. Seattle, as you know, has huge traffic problems. The mayor here is studying a congestion fee, put a ring around a portion of downtown Seattle and say, if you want to drive in here, we will automatically toll you like they do on the 520 bridge.
Well, I think I've got a significant problem with that for those of us that come to this city for health care we can't get other places, for Mariners, Seahawks. I think that there's a commerce issue for those of us that come through here. It sort of takes the welcome mat out.
Representative Springer.
So I would like to see some significant rural economic development so that there are congestion problems in Ritzville. And I would support Ritzville's willingness to put a congestion pricing thing on there. Slightly facetious. On the one hand, as a former mayor and a local government guy, I'm really reticent to preempt local decision making. Where that line gets drawn, however, is when that local decision making really has an impact on the state in general, and I fear this moves in that direction, so I'm a little skeptical.
All right, and Representative Wilcox.
Well, I have to say, I am really concerned about some of the rules that have been imposed on rural areas by urban people with good intentions. And although I hope that they don't do a congestion fee for the same reasons that Mark Schoesler mentioned, passing this bill would not be a priority for me.
All right, thank you. Let's get to our audience questions, and we've got some great questions here and I'm going to start with really just one of the topics we haven't addressed a lot. This question is specifically for Representative Springer, but if one or two of the others wanted to jump in briefly, that's great. In light of the current affordable housing crunch in greater Seattle metropolitan area, do you foresee a likelihood to pass a bill to reform construction warranty obligations in condominiums, which offer entry-level housing opportunities?
Yes, I do. I think there's going to be at least one bill. I know Representative Tana Sen from Mercer Island is working on a bill. I've worked on that issue before, construction liability, whether it's single family or condo. It is clear we've got to somehow assess what is preventing condo construction. Those are in many cases the entry levels, how I got started, bought my first one-bedroom condo and moved up from there. So right now we're building a lot of condos in Washington, but they all start at $1 million, and that's not helping the affordability quotient that we need to get at. So I think we're going to look seriously at that legislation.
Okay.
Anybody else want to jump in on that? Got a contrary opinion? This is a question about legislative leadership. It's a question to all panelists, and the question is, it's striking to me that today's panel, which represents senior leadership in our legislature, is comprised entirely of middle-aged white men. What are you doing? What are you doing to encourage and develop more diverse leadership in our state government? And I ask this question because I think, having talked to most of you about this topic, you're thinking about it. And I also mentioned at the beginning that the makeup of the legislature is different this year, but I do want to give you each a chance to address diversity in the legislature, but in leadership as well.
I can start. You know, I'm excited about the legislature is more diverse. I think about, you know, a kid growing up in Washington State and looking at their elected leaders and not seeing anybody that looks like them. And the idea of that, those role models for them, that's changing. And our legislature is looking now more like the state that we represent. But it's more than that. It's when we have that diversity, we get better ideas. We have better decision making. We have better input when we have that diversity. So I'm excited about that. Particularly, our caucus has gotten more diverse, and our leadership for the Senate Democratic Caucus is the most diverse leadership that we have ever had, with Indian American, Latina, Native American, LGBTQ, and I think that you'll see the legislature continuing to move in that direction. So yes, this is not a positive representation of what I am saying at this table, but I think that overall, when you look at the legislature, there's reason to be optimistic about diversity.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to note that the invitation is to the top legislative leaders from each caucus. Representative Springer is, I guess, technically filling in for Speaker Chop, but just to be clear in terms of how the invitation's issued, Senator Schoesler.
I'd like to thank the person that asked this question, because I'm complimented to be called middle-aged now.
I was upset about it, actually.
You and me, Mark.
Younger people like Senator Billig might not appreciate it, but anyway, thank you, whoever asked for the compliment. And I think if you look at the Majority Coalition Caucus, formerly Majority Coalition Caucus, we're We got there by having a record number of women. 3 of the top 4 leaders in my caucus are women, and 6 of the 8 elected are women. I would happily turn an early morning in Seattle over to Senator Becker if that's what it took.
And I think that the same is true of the House Democratic Caucus. I just made a little quick list here as you mentioned that question. We have 2 women, both women of color, who are part of our leadership team, the 8-member leadership team that we have created. We also have women who are the chair. Leadership is not just the 8 people or the 7 people who sit in the Speaker's office. It also extends to the policy arena, which is in many ways the most important one, and that's committee chairs. We have women who chair healthcare, early learning, finance, community health, or community housing and development. We have a woman who is the vice chair of the Appropriations Committee, and we have a woman who chairs Judiciary, and I'm sure I've missed a couple. So, and we just added, if I off the top of my head, 3 or 4 women of color in this last election, and I think you're going to see that evolution of the color of this table and the gender of this table change over time.
I even have a prediction that if you come back next year, there may be a woman Speaker of the House sitting where Larry Springer is.
Could very well be.
Representative Wilcox.
Well, I won't make any age jokes. But I'm glad you asked the question, because clearly you put your finger on a problem that all of us have. But it wouldn't be any secret if I say that I know that Republicans and House Republicans have a ways to go to be more representative of the people that live in the state of Washington. And I think all of us are making sincere attempts to do that. And in fact, I was quite proud of the candidates that ran to be a House Republican. This was not a great year to be a Republican, and many of the very diverse candidates that we had were defeated. I'm going to keep trying. Republicans in Washington have a proud tradition of female leadership. I think the first Senate Majority Leader was a woman in Mark's caucus several decades ago. And we're not going to give up on this.
One of the other questions from our audience, a subject we haven't really talked about, is Orcas. This is addressed to Representative Springer, but I think others may want to just jump in briefly. It says, Linda Mapes of the Seattle Times has written several articles about the plight of the Puget Sound orcas. They are clearly on track to extinction, and I should clarify, that's the southern resident orcas. There are other orca groups that are doing quite well. But our questioner goes on to say, would you support the removal of the lower Snake River dams if it is determined that is the most effective measure and that the electrical power generation is no longer needed because it could come from somewhere else?
That was clearly a question intended actually for Senator Schoesler.
I'm sure Mark will answer it as well. So right now, I'm not sure we know. The legislature clearly does not know. And I don't know about the scientific community out there that they know what is the best, most prudent, cost-effective way of addressing the danger of losing the orcas. They're iconic to our region. We need to do everything we can to preserve them. I'll answer that question here in a second. There are a number of ideas that are out there. One is, something like stop fishing. Well, if you make your livelihood with a commercial fishing boat, that's probably not very tenable for you. Removing the dams on the Snake River, electrical generation is one thing. So is barge traffic. And I don't know how many wheat farmers depend on a barge getting down our river system, but it's not just as simplistic as determining whether or not the electricity generated is needed or not. So I think this is a really complicated issue. The governor clearly has highlighted it, and we're going to spend a lot of time looking at what the alternatives are.
Senator Schoesler, you want to jump in?
Thank you. 100% renewables, solar farms and carbon, don't work without clean, affordable hydropower. Whether you breach the Snake River dams, the Skagit River Dam, dams in Mason County, you can't have that affordable future without it. And if we really want to save the Orcas, the time involved in breaching those dams, which are federal, not state, so we're really wasting our time, don't get you there. You have to look at what can we do immediately, almost immediately, that is a benefit. Otherwise, we're going to be tied up in court and fighting, waiting for a solution, and the last Orca will be gone before we get there. So you look at those, what can we do immediately? What can we do almost immediately? And I think there are recommendations from the task force. For example, we've dramatically reduced our hatchery production in this state. Well, you can increase hatchery production and returns quicker than you can breach dams, quicker than you can remove every single culvert. And predators, I'd like to thank Senator Cantwell and Senator Risch from Idaho that they were willing to take on the issue of predators. What good does it do to bring those fish back if we're feeding them to cormorants and seals? So let's look at what gets it done before the last orca's gone and move ahead.
Hey, could I quickly answer that too? I'm also a Puget Sound legislator. This isn't only about orcas. Of course, orca recovery is about salmon recovery. It's also about a tribal way of life. And I've been with a number of tribes recently, and they're scared to death, not just about having salmon to eat, but losing their culture. And we should be just as concerned about losing that priceless culture through allowing salmon to go away as we are about the orcas. And I agree with Mark. Those two immediate steps, predation and ramping up hatchery production, is the most important thing to do right now.
Okay. We have time for one last question, and that has to do with the safe workplace environment in the state legislature. Obviously, the legislature has not been immune from the Me Too movement. There are lawmakers who won't be returning this year because of allegations against them. You are both, the House and the Senate, have worked over the interim to develop new workplace conduct rules, to set up new reporting opportunities for victims. None of that is quite locked in yet, but I want to hear from each of you briefly about your commitment to making sure that the legislative environment is safe for people working there, visiting there, and otherwise trying to do the work of the state.
Well, I'm absolutely committed to making sure that the Senate and the legislature as a whole is a safe and welcoming and inclusive place to work and to visit. And I'm really proud of the bipartisan work that we've done in the legislature and in the Senate to address this and to create a code of conduct, appropriate workplace policy, which has been, again, bipartisan and staff-driven. And that policy is now complete. And now we're going to take some steps to formalize it in Senate rules and with the Facility and Operations Committee, which Senator Schoesler and I both serve on, which is the sort of administrative committee that runs the Senate. And then also we're talking about some how we do that jointly with the House, whether that's, again, joint rules or in the resolution. But those are more technical steps. The most important piece is that we've had an inclusive, staff-driven, bipartisan process to help address this. And we still have work to do. I don't want it to sound like we're done, but I'm proud of the progress that we've made.
Senator Schoesler.
Short answer, since Senator Billig did an excellent job, we're committed to cooperation as members and staff across the aisle to address this issue.
And it's also true of the House Democratic Caucus. I think back over the last year, and every leadership meeting we had over the last year, this was on the agenda. We talked about it constantly. We have cooperated, obviously, with the Senate in terms of setting up a staff-driven, bipartisan work group that is making recommendations on how to create a workplace where it's safe and where victims feel supported if they come forward. That's really critical, and we're working hard to try and achieve that and get everybody on that page.
I have confidence that we're going to make the necessary changes to processes and procedures, but as leaders, it's absolutely essential that all of us commit to applying our top management priority to constantly reminding people and making sure that those who have been victimized have safe ways to report it, and that we immediately counsel people that don't understand where the line is, and then we apply the sanctions when that is justified by the rules.
Let me give you, as we wrap up, each just take 30 seconds for some closing thoughts. Whatever is on your mind as we get into this next legislative session starting on Monday. And Representative Springer, why don't you start?
Get out on time with a balanced budget on day 105, not day 104, because somebody will be really angry that their bill didn't pass on 105 day. But get out on the 105th day with a balanced budget.
Representative Wilcox?
Do the best we can on policy, and don't forget that there's a rainy day coming.
Senator Billig?
You know, I guess I'll use my 30 seconds. I want to remind everybody this is a team sport, making policy. It's a participatory sport. We work for you, and we can only do a good job of representing you and working on your behalf if we hear from you. So coming to events like this and getting questions is great. Sending emails, visiting your legislators, if you have ideas for bills, all of that is not only important, it's essential for us to do a good job on your behalf. So thank you in advance for your participation in this session.
Senator Schoesler, the last word.
Thank you. And I think we need to retain optimism when we get there Monday, or we shouldn't be members. We should remain optimistic about the state of Washington and our future. Remain optimistic and have a good session.
Thanks to all of our panelists.
I'm glad you're optimistic.
And please join me in thanking Austin and Essex for a fantastic job.